All right.
This meeting is being recorded.
Hi, everybody. We're back again with author Kevin McAleer on our mostly weekly video chat. Sometimes we take 2 or 3 weeks between these things, but this is back to our weekly chat on Saturdays here. And we've covered quite a few American authors: Hemingway, Fitzgerald, Jack London, Raymond Chandler, James M. Cain. And a lot of those writers are either California writers or Los Angeles writers. And so Kevin, here he is with one of his favorite authors, Charles Bukowski. We thought we'd give at least one session to that, since that informs much of Kevin's literature and much of his interest in other writers. I kind of am doing it a little bit under protest, in the sense that I try to, promote more of a Catholic kind of literature and art in my own academy that I have. And so I'm a little bit leery of Bukowski. I think he might have a bit of profanity and those kind of elements in there that might be over the top to some people, especially if they have a more religious, moral view of the arts. But we'll let Kevin make a case here and see how it goes. And maybe we'll do another Bukowski session after this, or maybe this will be the only one. Let's just kind of play it by ear. So Kevin apparently wants to start with a novel called Ham on Rye, about an autobiographical work about Bukowski growing up in Los Angeles as a young man. And Kevin just had a book come out called L.A. Kid, which has a similar theme. So Kevin might have much to say on this topic. And all that, and I have not read any Bukowski lately. I didn't have an occasion to get to the library to pick up a copy of Ham on Rye this week. I'm just going to trust Kevin on this one and follow his lead. So Kevin, tell us what your thoughts are on Ham on Rye or any other novels of Bukowski, or poetry.
Well, we'll stick with Ham on Rye because it takes place in Los Angeles of the 1920s, 30s, and early 40s, which has been a period that we've treated with at least two of our authors, James M. Cain and Raymond Chandler, and that interwar Los Angeles, which interests me the most. And that's why I want to start with this one. Also because there are many parallels between his book and mine. The parallels will be evident as we speak, I hope, if any of you know my own biography. But that's the main interest, that it's treating Los Angeles of this period, a period also in which my father came of age. So this is a coming-of-age novel. Bukowski was born in 1920. Our father was born in 1928. Bukowski was about 7.5 years older. So not quite the same generation, but pretty much. And where Bukowski grew up, he grew up in a place called, what's it called? I wrote it down. It's got a strange, Mid-City. It's called Mid-City in central LA. It's a little bit northeast of Culver City, and just north of where now the Santa Monica Freeway runs, to give you some idea of where he grew up and where most of the action here takes place. He also went to Los Angeles High School, which is, I think, pretty much the oldest high school in Los Angeles. Our father went to Hollywood High School. They grew up just a couple miles away from each other. So this is a milieu with which I'm fascinated, if only by virtue of the familial connection, but also through the cultural connection, because this is Hollywood, right? They all grew up just miles, if not, less than that, from major studios. Our father grew up on Orange Drive, which was just a hop, skip, and a jump from Paramount Studios. And Bukowski grew up just a little ways away from MGM there in Culver City. Just an example of what I'm talking about in terms of how this whole period and this time and this place fascinates me historically. So that's why I chose the book. And it's his greatest novel. He wrote 6 in his life, and this is his greatest. He wrote it after he'd written 3 already. Post Office, 1971. So he wrote his first novel when he was 51. I always like guys who write their first novel later on in life, like myself. As we have mentioned, Chandler wrote his first novel when he was 50 or 51, 1939. Chandler born 1888. And Kane wrote his first novel when he was in his early 40s. That was Post Office, 1971. In 1975, he wrote his second novel called Factotum. In 1978, he wrote his third novel called Women. Ham on Rye came out in 1982. His fifth novel was Hollywood, 1989, and then 1994, the year of his death, his final and 6th novel, Pulp, came out. But this is by far his greatest, and this is not only my opinion, this is the consensus. Where do I start?
I just wanted to also add for the viewers who are leery of too much profane elements. Kevin has said when he quotes from it, he'll try to avoid the more profane bits. Just a little disclaimer there.
It's easily done. He's only profane in certain sections.
Okay.
And he's profane in those sections primarily where I am also profane in my LA Kid. It's how people speak, you know, in certain social circles. It's unavoidable, particularly when you're a kid. Now, the question that you would raise is, why do you have to include that in your writing, however? Well, if you're going to give a sort of a gritty treatment, a real hands-on gritty treatment of, you know, growing up in LA in certain sections of it, then I would argue you do.
Yeah.
If you want to have a realistic effect.
Well, you know, and I've mentioned in previous discussions that even Flannery O'Connor, the quintessential Catholic author, has the GD word thrown in there and the N word quite a bit. And
right.
she gets a pass because she's a Catholic. And by the way, was Bukowski a Catholic?
I'm a Catholic. I'm a Catholic. Do I get a pass? I'm baptized.
No, but what about
Bukowski? Bukowski, his mother was from a Catholic family. His mother, this is interesting, was a native-born German. His father was an American, but of German extraction. Bukowski's grandfather, his father's father, came to America in the 1880s, and he established himself as some kind of building developer. I don't know exactly, but those were the Bukowskis, originally from Poland. It's a Polish name, but according to Bukowski, having migrated to Germany, Prussia, more specifically, sometime in the 18th century. And Bukowski was born in Andernach, Germany in 1920. That's in the western part of Germany. And his father was a soldier in the First World War. Most of his time was spent as an occupying force for the Allies in the Rhineland. You may recall that the Rhineland was occupied after the Versailles Treaty, and his father was one of the occupying soldiers. Met his mother, right? And apparently Bukowski said he was born out of wedlock. He wasn't quite. He was born a month after the marriage, so maybe it was a forced marriage. Who knows? One thing is sure, that the parents didn't get along that well. That the father was a rather brutal man. He seems to have physically abused not only Bukowski, his only son, his only child, but his wife, both verbally and physically. And that's a great part of the story, how this brutal father, he's completely unlikable. Not really a redeeming quality to him at all, as far as Bukowski tells it.
Kev, question. So you said he was part of the military occupying force, so that he was a German of German extraction, but he was with the American army, not the German.
That's right. That's right. So he found, he met a nice German girl he liked, and there was probably an affinity just because of the shared German heritage. So that probably made perfect sense to him and to her, and what could go wrong? Well, as I've alluded to, a lot went wrong later on. Bukowski left Andernach. Well, his parents left with him when he was 2.5 years old. Apparently, he grew up speaking German. That's what is said. If so, he had forgotten everything that he'd learned up until 2.5. He probably spoke it beyond that, because his mother probably spoke it with him even when they left for America and eventually ended up in Los Angeles. And that's interesting for me, because he has a very strange way of talking, Bukowski. You've heard him. He talks real slow and very deliberately, as if it's almost a foreign language to him. Okay, you've heard videos, you've seen videos of him.
I've seen some videos, sure.
That's how he speaks. He doesn't speak in a rush. He chooses his words very carefully. And that's not how an American speaks. That's not how a Los Angelian speaks. We speak, rather slowly in comparison to someone from New York, maybe, right? More laid back, more casual. But there's a certain cadence. There's a certain, pace that we bring to our speech. And Bukowski was always very slow when he spoke. That could have something to do with it not being his first language. I don't know. Anyway, they ended up in Los Angeles, finally ended up in this part of town that I've just described, mid-city. And he describes the beatings that his father inflicted on him. I can maybe read you a passage. His father, Bukowski said that from the age of, I think it was about 6 to 11, his father beat him 3 times a week. That sounds a bit exaggerated, I have to tell you. I can't imagine that. It was almost like a ritual that he would beat him just for nothing. But apparently there were quite a few beatings. That's clear, it would seem to me. And he would often be beaten, or he would be beaten. It would be occasion for him to be beaten at the hands of his father if he didn't mow the lawn perfectly. That's one thing I have in common with Bukowski. He grew up on weekends having to mow the front and back lawns. I did that too. My father never beat me if I didn't get it right, but he would berate me if I didn't hop to it right away, which was, perfectly understandable. I was sort of recalcitrant when it came to mowing the lawn, and I deserved every verbal beating I got from my father, although he was, rather mild in comparison to what Bukowski describes here with his own father. Let me give you a little passage, if I may, see if I can't find it, where he describes it. Right. Okay. "Let's go," said my father, and I walked into the bathroom. He got the strop down. "Take down your pants and shorts," he said. I didn't do it. He reached in front of me, yanked my belt open, unbuttoned me, and yanked my pants down. He pulled down my shorts. The strop landed. It was the same explosive sound, the same pain. "You're going to kill your mother," he screamed. He had done something wrong, Bukowski. He hit me again, but the tears weren't coming. My eyes were strangely dry. I thought about killing him, that there must be a way to kill him. In a couple of years, I could beat him to death, but I wanted him now. He wasn't much of anything. I must have been adopted. He hit me again. The pain was still there, but the fear of it was gone. The strop landed again. The room no longer blurred. I could see everything clearly. My father seemed to sense the difference in me, and he began to lash me harder again and again. But the more he beat me, the less I felt. It was almost as if he was the one who was helpless. It was almost as if he was the one who was helpless. Something had occurred, something had changed. My father stopped, puffing, and I heard him hanging up the strop. He walked to the door. I turned. "Hey," I said. My father turned and looked at me. "Give me a couple more," I told him, "if it makes you feel any better." "Don't you dare talk to me that way," he said. I looked at him. I saw folds of flesh under his chin and around his neck. I saw sad wrinkles and crevices. His face was tired pink putty. He was in his undershirt, and his belly sagged, wrinkling his undershirt. The eyes were no longer fierce. His eyes looked away, and he couldn't meet mine. Something had happened. The bath towels knew it. The shower curtain knew it. The mirror knew it. The bathtub and the toilet knew it. My father turned and walked out the door. He knew it. It was my last beating. From him. There will be more beatings in the future, but not from the father. This is when Bukowski's about 12 or 13. And he suffered these things for many years, and he's getting big. Bukowski was a sizable fellow, like his father. His father was 6'2". Bukowski describes him exactly. Big, broad-shouldered, 6'2" guy. And a sadist, apparently. And that's a good example of Bukowski's prose. And here I can go off on my little hobby horse of Matthew Arnold and his 4 requirements for great writing. What are they, Tim? Can you name them?
You mentioned it a couple times before.
Okay, I'll tell you. Yeah, it's
conciseness, pace, simplicity.
Yeah.
And
nobility.
Nobility, yeah.
And that's a good example of all 4 of them. I would argue the rapidity, the way he describes that, boom, 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 boom. I mean, it's very and the sentence. Well, let me just say, just make my case, and then you can jump in if you don't mind.
Sure.
Okay. So the narrative pace, the directness. Right, and maybe I should clarify here. I've had a couple of people ask me, what do you mean directness and simplicity? They're basically the same thing. I say, no. I think what we're referring to, or what Arnold was referring to vis-a-vis the Iliad, what a good translation of the Iliad makes, that was actually the context of his observations. The directness of thought. There isn't any convoluted, curly-cued thought in Bukowski. It's very direct. You know exactly what he's talking about. It's not labored at all. And then the simplicity part comes in. You could even use a synonym for it, the synonym of the plainness of it. It's plain spoken. So the plain spoken expression of very direct and not unornate thought, if I can coin a very awkward phrase. And then, of course, the nobility. It's the nobility of a man who is set against his environment. And that's Bukowski here growing up in LA. The first obstacle is to just be able to deal with his father. And then it just broadens out into other aspects, getting along with the toughs out on the street, getting along with girls, meeting girls, getting within 10 paces of a pretty girl. He had a hard time of it. At school, as I said, athletics, he didn't do much of that, but he admired athletes. He had a tough time. And the other aspect of nobility is not only the subject in conflict with his environment, it's also the human heart in conflict with itself. I think that was a definition that Faulkner put out, maybe in his Nobel acceptance speech. I'm not sure. But those 2 levels of nobility where there's much suffering involved, and you're attempting to countenance it with as much dignity as possible. So I would argue just that even in that one passage, all four of these Arnoldian elements come into play. And you wanted to say something after I talked about directness.
Well, I was checking the Wikipedia entry on Bukowski yesterday, and it did say that one of his favorite writers was Ernest Hemingway.
Yeah.
And part of that was lack of adjectives in his descriptions. So that would speed up the pace a little bit.
Right. And that's the plain spoken prose as well.
Yeah. So there's that Hemingway influence. It said he also had an influence from Dostoevsky, very existential.
Yeah. He loved John Fonte, who was another Los Angeles writer. He wrote Ask the Dust. That's his classic. And he was writing in the 30s. I mean, he would be a natural for us to look at. Ask the Dust would be a natural to look at and study. I'm not a great fan of it.
You're talking about Fonte now?
We can maybe do John Fonte, Ask the Dust. He's another great Los Angeles writer. Not born in Los Angeles, but right. Few are, as we have seen. Bukowski, not even, although he's called an LA writer par excellence. Yeah. I'm one of the few LA writers that was born in LA. And fourth generation. Thank you very much. So,
yes.
But it just comes down to how well you describe the city and the people. And so.
Okay. Now, I try to look at the positive sides of Bukowski. One of the things that I would tend to like about him, if I recall past times when I've read him, he was very what you might call anti-woke. Is that not true?
Yeah, avant la lettre, before the term was coined.
Because you sent me a video of you with a few other authors talking about your anti-woke fiction, and he is probably the quintessential anti-woke person avant before the term came out.
Certainly. Yeah, he's old school. He's an old school male in the good and the bad ways that you might associate with that. But I think everyone knows what I'm alluding to when I talk about an old school American male growing up in the interwar years. It's pretty clear, but I'll give you an example. I'll give you an example of what maybe I'm talking about. He describes life in the Depression. He's a Depression era kid. You know, that's probably what unites him and every other American who grew up in this period, whether it was in LA or not. And let's see. Yeah, it gives you some idea of his influences. You can see them. He's talking about them when he's about 10 or 11. 5th grade became 6th grade, and I began to think about running away from home, but I decided that if most of our fathers couldn't get jobs, how in the hell could a guy under 5 feet tall get one? John Dillinger was everybody's hero, adults and kids alike. He took the money from the banks, and there was Pretty Boy Floyd and Ma Barker and Machine Gun Kelly. People began going to vacant lots where weeds grew. They had learned that some of the weeds could be cooked and eaten. There were fistfights between men in the vacant lots and on street corners. Everybody was angry. The men smoked Bull Durham and didn't take any, I'll spell it. Well, I'll leave it out.
any blank.
From anybody. They let the little round Bull Durham tags hang out of their front shirt pockets, and they could all roll a cigarette with one hand. When you saw a man with a Bull Durham tag dangling, that meant look out. People went around talking about second and third mortgages. My father came home one night with a broken arm and 2 black eyes. My mother had a low-paying job somewhere, and each boy in the neighborhood had 1 pair of Sunday pants and 1 pair of daily pants. When shoes wore out, there weren't any new ones. The department stores had soles and heels they sold for 15 or 20 cents along with the glue, and these were glued to the bottoms of the worn-out shoes. Gene's parents, his friend Gene, had one rooster and some chickens in their backyard, and if some chicken didn't lay enough eggs, they ate it. So he grew up in a tough environment. And that makes a certain man out of you, I should think. He was proud of it. He even wrote poetry later on that was sort of sentimental about that era. And it's interesting. I marked something here. You've gotten on a very pertinent topic regarding Bukowski. And let's see if I can't find something here. Okay, here's something. Sorry to delay. The 1930s. So he's thinking back to that era. He's writing a poem, and this is 50 years later, I think. It's entitled The 1930s. Places to hunt, places to hide are getting harder to find, and pet canaries and goldfish too. Did you notice that? I remember when pool halls were pool halls, not just tables in bars. And I remember when neighborhood women used to cook pots of beef stew for their unemployed husbands when their bellies were sick with fear. And I remember when kids used to watch the rain for hours and would fight to the end over a pet rat. And I remember when the boxers were all Jewish and Irish and never gave you a bad fight. And when the biplanes flew so low you could see the pilot's face in goggles. And when one ice cream bar in 10 had a free coupon inside, and when for 3 cents you could buy enough candy to make you sick or last a whole afternoon, and when the people in the neighborhood raised chickens in their backyards, chickens again, and we'd stuff a 5-cent toy auto full of candle wax to make it last forever, and when we built our own kites and scooters, and I remember when our parents fought, you could hear them for blocks, and they fought for hours, screaming blood, death, curses, and the cops never came. Places to hunt and places to hide, they're just not around anymore. I remember when each fourth lot was vacant and overgrown, and the landlord only got his rent when you had it, and each day was clear and good, and each moment was full of promise. It's an affirmation of that time, of how tough it was, but how it made a certain man out of you. I think that's what's going on there. So that to answer your question.
That would be interesting to hear you read that in the Bukowski cadence.
Well, it's his lines.
Yeah.
It's blank verse.
Yeah.
But he has a certain length of line, then it's stop and then go. Stop, go, stop, go. Yeah.
Okay. Very good. He wrote a lot of poetry, apparently.
He was mainly a poet. The novels were like sidelights, it seems to me. Before he died, he had about 25 books he'd written. That's not including all the chap books and the broadsides and everything else he was writing before he was discovered. Now, we've all got a lot of those. Those don't count. But he had, so he had 6 novels published in his lifetime, and then 25 books. A good portion of them were short story anthologies, but the vast majority were poetry. And he's a great, great poet, in my estimation.
Yeah, I remember reading some of his poetry and being really impressed by it.
It's quite moving. And so is Ham on Rye again. He, in fact, said, I remember an interview with him, where he said it was the hardest book he ever had to write, because he was dredging up all these old, painful memories. And I can understand that, having done the same thing recently. And by the way, both our books about growing up in LA came out in the year when we turned 62. How's that for a coincidence?
There you go.
Here's another coincidence, just to play with it. Here's a guy, Bukowski, who is born and lives his first few years in Germany. Then he moves to LA. Here's a guy who spent his first years in LA and has moved to Germany.
You are the new Bukowski.
I could only hope that I should, even be in consideration for that honor. No way. The guy's incomparable, and I wouldn't even want to be. Why? not because he didn't write beautifully, but he had a tough life, real tough life, a lot of suffering. And if you can turn that suffering into art, all the better. But you gotta really be, yeah. I wouldn't have wanted to have been him.
Yeah, well, you're quite good on just being yourself. So there you go.
Well, second, third-rate Bukowski, whatever.
No,
I'll take it.
You're a second-rate Bukowski, but a first-rate Kevin McAleer.
I'll take it.
That reminds me of the when George Gershwin went to France to visit Ravel in 1927 when he wrote American in Paris. He wanted to get music lessons from Ravel, and Ravel said, well, you can either be a second-rate Ravel or a first-rate Gershwin. So,
yeah.
I recommend you don't take lessons from me.
Yeah. Well, you can take lessons from Bukowski, certainly. I mean, one lesson is interesting, just on a very technical level. Maybe no one will appreciate this except him. But one thing you see in his writing, when you try to get his effects, I mean, I am a guy who studies writers. It's probably my academic background. I read the books, and then I'll reread them, and then I'll reread them again to see how they get certain effects that I too want to achieve. And there is a great poetry to Bukowski's prose. I'll just sidelight. I'll veer off from this briefly, and we'll get back to it. I'll read another passage to show you how I think his prose is poetic. Let me see. Okay. This is something where he's talking about his future. He's about 18 or 19 here. I could see the road ahead of me. I was poor and I was going to stay poor. But I didn't particularly want money. I didn't know what I wanted. Yes, I did. I wanted someplace to hide out, someplace where one didn't have to do anything. The thought of being something didn't only appall me, it sickened me. The thought of being a lawyer or a councilman or an engineer, anything like that, seemed impossible to me. To get married, to have children, to get trapped in the family structure, to go someplace to work every day and to return, it was impossible. To do things, simple things, to be part of family picnics, Christmas, the 4th of July, Labor Day, Mother's Day. Was a man born just to endure these things and then die? I would rather be a dishwasher, return alone to a tiny room and drink myself to sleep. So not a lover of humanity, the young Bukowski, nor was the older Bukowski. He described himself as a misanthrope. But I would argue there's a certain poetry in those lines. And I'll read you another passage, which I wanted to read because I found it extremely touching. And we have to get on this topic, excuse me. Bukowski, not only did he suffer at the hands of his father, and he felt like an outsider because people called him Heine, you know, that's a derogatory term for Germans back then. I guess it later was Kraut, you know, after the Second World War, but it was Heine then, short for Heinrich, right? And his name was Henry, actually. Yeah. And so it's not Charles. His real name is Henry. Is the middle name Charles? I'm not sure, but Henry Charles Bukowski. And his alter ego in all his novels is, or at least 5, is Henry Chinaski. So he uses his real first name in this novel and in others. And he describes an episode where Max Schmeling defeats Joe Louis. People all know about Louis knocking out Schmeling, but they don't know that that was a return match. And that in the first match, Schmeling knocked out Joe Louis. And this is in the early 30s. And Bukowski describes how he went right into the street and say, yeah, Schmeling beat Louis, Schmeling, because he was rooting for the German guy, right? His German family and everything. Having been born there. And everyone turned away and walked away, and no one was interested in celebrating with him. And that was sort of emblematic of how he felt like an outsider in every which way. But he particularly felt like an outsider when he was 14 and he broke out with terrible acne, really bad acne. Now, I had acne when I was a kid, and it was not as bad as Bukowski describes his acne. It was pretty bad, and I had it for a number of years. They couldn't really do anything. It was very frustrating. And I understand Bukowski and how he describes, just by virtue of the face you presented to the world, you felt like an outsider. You weren't pretty. You weren't anything that people wanted to, spend time looking at with pleasure for very long, And so you felt like an outsider, and it turned you in on yourself. You become more introspective. And so I have great sympathy for that aspect of it. And I'm not even trying to compare the acne that I had with his, because his was apparently really, really bad. And you can, I have scars from my own acne still, but you see pictures of Bukowski, it's really pocked and pitted. It's tragic. It's terrible. And that can have a real effect on you throughout your life. Now, Bukowski, he thematizes this in his book. It's a major theme, how he was ugly. He felt ugly. People told him he was ugly. This is another thing when you're growing up, and in my instance again, where I had acne, people, not girls, but guys, they have no problem telling you you're ugly and you got zits. Hey, pizza face. They have no problem with that, right? The good thing about that is it inures you to insults, and you learn to shake them off. You don't take them to heart. You notice them. They hurt a lot at first, but when you keep hearing them, you're just used to it, and it makes you tough. It makes you inwardly tough. I have to say that, And so I have a great deal of sympathy for him. And here he describes how he did not go to his senior prom, nor did I. Not because of my bad complexion, but it was basically because I went to an all-boys school. I wasn't meeting any girls, not that readily. Not girls for calling up on a date or asking to prom. So here's the very touching passage, which I argue is very poetic, which his poetic training, where his poetic training really shows. And the senior prom, he's ugly, doesn't have a date. And here he writes about it. It's a bit extended, but please bear with me. Finally, it was the day of the senior prom. It was held in the girls' gym with live music, a real band. I don't know why, but I walked over that night, the 2.5 miles from my parents' place. I stood outside in the dark, and I looked in there through the wire-covered window, and I was astonished. All the girls looked very grown up, stately, lovely. They were in long dresses, and they all looked beautiful. I almost didn't recognize them. And the boys in their tuxes, they looked great. They danced so straight, each of them holding a girl in his arms, their faces pressed against the girl's hair. They all danced beautifully, and the music was loud and clear and good, powerful. Then I caught a glimpse of my reflection staring in at them. Boils and scars on my face, my ragged shirt. I was like some jungle animal drawn to the light and looking in. Why had I come? I felt sick, but I kept watching. The dance ended. There was a pause. Couples spoke easily to each other. It was natural and civilized. Where had they learned to converse and to dance? I couldn't converse or dance. Everybody knew something I didn't know. The girls looked so good, the boys so handsome. I would be too terrified to even look at one of those girls, let alone be close to one. To look into her eyes or dance with her would be beyond me. And yet I knew that what I saw wasn't as simple and good as it appeared. There was a price to be paid for it all. a general falsity that could be easily believed and could be the first step down a dead-end street. The band began to play again, and the boys and girls began to dance again, and the lights revolved overhead, throwing shades of gold, then red, then blue, then green, then gold again on the couples. As I watched them, I said to myself, someday my dance will begin. When that day comes, I will have something that they don't have. But then it got to be too much for me. I hated them. I hated their beauty, their untroubled youth. And as I watched them dance through the magic-colored pools of light, holding each other, feeling so good, little unscathed children, temporarily in luck, I hated them because they had something I had not yet had. And I said to myself again, someday I will be as happy as any of you. You will see. They kept dancing, and I repeated it to them. Now, I would argue it's a very touching and poetic passage, and that's not the kind of Bukowski that we're usually presented with. It's the crude, it's the salacious, it's the vulgar Bukowski. But that is not primarily in evidence in this coming-of-age book, where you have a very sensitive kid, but he has been toughened by his outside circumstances, and then you have that conflict in heart, that heart in conflict with itself, which I mentioned as being a hallmark of tragic and even noble literature.
You told me earlier before we went online that he kind of is a Christ figure in these narratives.
Well, he's not suffering for our sins, but I said that in the sense that there's great suffering involved, and it's not something that he has necessarily brought upon himself. It has just descended upon him, like God the Father saying, you know, you're going to have to be crucified, Jesus. I'm sorry, this is your task. And there's some real painful passages there. That's one of the more painful ones, but there are many others. It's a book of constant. It's a Calvary, the book.
Where does the title Ham on Rye come from?
That's got lots of discussion on it on the internet. He never came clean with that. He never said where it came from. I don't think.
Just a very kind of offbeat title.
Right.
Kind of a non sequitur title just for the heck of it.
Yeah, you and I discussed that by email when we were trying to come up with a title for LA Kid. And I just threw in the towel. I said, I'm just going to call it LA Kid. Just on the nose what it's about. And, strangely enough, there are no other books out there called LA Kid. I'm the first.
That is very, very surprising.
Nothing out there, nothing at all. No one felt that the title was worth gracing a book with. It's pretty banal. It's pretty straightforward, but I've got it now.
You've got the most archetypal title for an LA Kid in that title right there.
Well, I thought Surfer Boy is the first novel, and then LA Kid now is the fourth. It'd be like nice little symmetry there.
Okay. All right. What else does Bukowski have? We might as well do a general survey of his other works.
Oh, we can't do it in 5 minutes, Tim. But as I said, he's a very wide-ranging talent. The novels, the poetry. He didn't rhyme poetry. It's blank verse. It's modern kind of stuff.
Okay.
A lot of it. In fact, I just ordered a book recently. It's his collected poems, not all of them, but the best of the best. And it's called The Pleasures of the Damned. And his editor, the editor for this, I think it's his editor at Black Sparrow Press, who was publishing his stuff very early on. He put in a lot of Bukowski's early poetry, which is kind of modernistic. It's kind of wordplay, jumbly stuff that I don't get and don't like. But his later stuff is great. It's just like he's basically taking short vignettes from his life and then finding deeper meaning in them, or not, but giving us a little slice of life a la Hemingway, but from his own sort of skewed Angelino view. there's something I want to quote. One of his novels, his penultimate novel, is Hollywood. It's about his experience making the film Barfly, which was based on his writings. And he wrote the screenplay, Bukowski. You know the film well, starring Mickey Rourke in the 80s. And Bukowski was talking to his director about how the young Bukowski should be portrayed. And Mickey Rourke would be portraying it. And we all know Mickey Rourke, right? He's this kind of, tough guy, strutting, I guess he's from the East Coast, Florida, maybe originally. He spent time in New York. And Bukowski describes the difference between a California kid, I think he's talking about LA, because Bukowski doesn't know California at all. He spent all his life in LA, right? So he's talking LA. And he's talking about how Mickey Rourke should play the role. And he says, John's the fictional name of this director. John. Oh, it has to be said. Hollywood's about his experience making Barfly. Okay. Bukowski says, John, he can't be New York. This main character is a California boy. California boys are laid back in the woodwork. They don't come rushing out. They cool it and figure their next move. Less panic. And under all this, they have the ability to kill. But they don't blow a lot of smoke first. I think that's a fair definition. When comparing my own upbringing and personality with East Coast guys or Chicago guys or whatever, they blow a lot of smoke, these guys. They're in your face. They think they're really tough stuff. And maybe they are. But don't play with an LA kid, okay? Because we take our time. We're gonna lay for you, okay? At some point, we're taking notes, and then we strike. I thought that was very good. And he said California, but he's talking about an LA kid, I would argue. Just wanted to get that in.
What about Post Office?
Okay, folks. Full disclosure. Tim introduced me to Bukowski via Post Office. You did.
Okay. I don't recall that, but you say so.
Yeah, it's a great novel. Beautiful, wonderful, great first novel. It's about his 11 years, I think, that we're at the LA Post Office. It's hilarious. That's something we haven't mentioned, how funny Bukowski is. He's really, really funny. And that comes out also to a large degree in Ham on Rye. But it's mixed in with but that is Bukowski. It's a lot of humor mixed in with a lot of sadness. That's basically what he does best. And Ham on Rye, again, that's what we got on this topic. I don't know what it means exactly, but I always conjectured that Ham, as in like a ham actor, kind of a hammy guy, because he was a smart aleck in school, right? He talked back. He had a smart mouth, and so Ham on Rye, not R-Y-E. Well, that's how it's spelled in the title, but W-R-Y, right? So kind of a wry attitude toward things. And what does rye mean? It means you're sort of making light of a painful situation.
So he's a ham, but he's doing it in a wry fashion.
That's how I made sense of it. And it probably is completely wrong. It's probably, as you said, just a non sequitur title that he came up with for his own reasons, and let people like you and me 30 years after his death speculate on it.
Yeah, that sounds logical.
That's the most logical explanation, actually, probably.
Apparently, two things we haven't mentioned about. We got 10 minutes left here. We didn't mention that he grew up he spent his time on Skid Row as a homeless man.
Yes. I can give you a passage about that.
Okay.
And let me see if I can't get to it quickly for a change. Yes, I think I can. Yeah. So here he's left. So after he graduated from Los Angeles High School, he spent a year or two at LA City College studying journalism, okay? Dropped out at a certain point, wanted to be a writer very, very early on, tried his hand at writing. And he got thrown out of his house by his father, apparently, or Bukowski left of his own volition. It's not clear to me. Anyway, short paragraph. I made practice runs down to Skid Row to get ready for my future. There's a little Bukowski humor. I didn't like what I saw down there. Those men and women had no special daring or brilliance. They wanted what everybody else wanted. There were also some obvious mental cases down there who were allowed to walk the streets undisturbed. I had noticed that both in the very poor and very rich extremes of society, the mad were often allowed to mingle freely. I knew that I wasn't entirely sane. I still knew, as I had as a child, that there was something strange about myself. I felt as if I were destined to be a murderer, a bank robber, a saint, a rapist, a monk, a hermit. I needed an isolated place to hide. Skid Row was disgusting. The life of the sane, average man was dull, worse than death. There seemed to be no possible alternative. Education also seemed to be a trap. The little education I had allowed myself had made me more suspicious. What were doctors, lawyers, scientists? They were just men who allowed themselves to be deprived of their freedom to think and act as individuals. I went back to my shack and drank. He had a little shack on Bunker Hill. Very odd, but that was the case. He paid like $350 a week for it, and had a little shack. And he just tried to get through the day, and he drank and read. Got books at the Hollywood Library, I think is where it was. That later burned down. And I just want to maybe end here, Tim. If I can take the ball and run with it. He had very few friends. He was a real loner. But one friend he did have was a guy he met at LACC. And he was another young man who wanted to be a writer. And Bukowski basically ends his novel with this friendship. And I would like to read a passage about it, because here again is more of the touching Bukowski, not what we usually get, right? And not even the image he wanted to project. He kept saying, boy, if they ever catch me, in a sentimental mood, I won't be able to sell any more books in Europe. Because that was the kind of image that he pretended he wanted to project, sell books, but that was partly him, but there was a whole other part of him, and that's the part that I'm trying to harp on right now. So this is December 7th, 1941. And he's in the bar with this good friend of his who has, in the meantime, joined the Marines. Okay. Bukowski writes, this is extended, but it won't take us past the hour. There was a small radio in the bar. There was a popular song playing. Then in the middle of the song, there was an interruption. The announcer said, a bulletin has just come in. The Japanese have bombed Pearl Harbor. I repeat, the Japanese have just bombed Pearl Harbor. All military personnel are requested to return immediately to their bases. We looked at each other, hardly able to understand what we just heard. Well, said Becker quietly. Becker is his friend in the Marines. That's it. Finish your beer, I told him. Becker took a hit. Geez, suppose some stupid SOB points a machine gun at me and pulls the trigger. That could well happen. Hank? Henry Chinaski, nickname Hank in the book. Hank? What? Will you ride back to the base with me on the bus? I can't do that. I never told you this, said Becker, but I'm an orphan. Damn, I said. Will you at least come to the bus depot with me? Sure. We got up and walked toward the door. The barkeep was rubbing his hands all over his apron. He had his apron all bunched up and was excitedly rubbing his hands on it. Good luck, Marine, he hollered. Becker walked out. I paused inside the door and looked back at the barkeep. World War I, eh? Yeah, he said happily. I caught up with Becker. We half ran to the bus depot together. Servicemen in uniform were already beginning to arrive. The whole place had an air of excitement. Becker stood in the ticket line. One of the servicemen had his girlfriend with him. The girl was talking, crying, holding on to him, kissing him. Poor Becker only had me. I stood to one side, waiting. It was a long wait. Becker finally had his ticket. I walked him to his bus. He stood in another line. Any advice? He asked. No. The line was filing slowly into the bus. The girl was weeping and talking rapidly and quietly to her soldier. Becker was at the door. I punched him on the shoulder. You're the best I've known. Thanks, Hank. Goodbye. And to end, Bukowski in this collection of poems, and to the credit of his editor this time, he wrote a poem with this Becker fellow, Becker in the novel, but his name in the poem is Robert Baun, B-A-U-N. I presume that's his real name. And we have a little poem which I suppose is dedicated to Robert Baun, although not explicitly. It's short. We'll finish here. The poem is called Self-Inflicted Wounds. He talked about Steinbeck and Thomas Wolfe, and he wrote like a cross between the two of them. And I lived in a hotel on Figueroa Street, close to the bars, and he lived further uptown in a small room, and we both wanted to be writers, and we'd meet at the public library, sit on the stone benches and talk about that. He showed me his short stories, and he wrote well. He wrote better than I did. There was a calm and a strength in his work that mine did not have. My stories were jagged, harsh, with self-inflicted wounds. I showed him all my work, but he was more impressed with my drinking prowess and my worldly attitude. After talking a bit, we would go to Clifton's cafeteria for our only meal of the day, for less than $1 in 1941. Yet, we were in great health. We lost jobs, found jobs, lost jobs. Mostly we didn't work. We always envisioned we soon would be receiving regular checks from the New Yorker, the Atlantic Monthly, and Harper's. We ran with a gang of young men who didn't envision anything at all, but they had a gallant, lawless charm, and we drank with them and fought with them and had a hell of a wild good time. Then, just like that, he joined the Marine Corps. I want to prove something to myself, was what he told me. He did. Right after boot camp, the war came, and in 3 months, he was dead. And I promised myself that someday I would write a novel and that I would dedicate it to him. I have now written 5 novels, all dedicated to others. So a little elegy for his good friend, his only really good friend in the whole book, Ham on Rye, and how he basically ends the novel with that parting.
That was a poem he wrote, or that was the end of Ham on Rye?
What I just read was a poem he had written.
Okay.
And the poem's title was Self-Inflicted Wounds.
Right. And in Ham on Rye, does he end it with that friendship as well, did you say?
Yes, where they part at the bus depot, and then Bukowski says, "You're the best I've known. Thanks, Hank. Goodbye."
Well, you know what? That's the end of our own session. So perfect timing with the endings there of the poem you read and the novel. That brings us to the end of our own session. So, Kevin, thanks a lot for this survey of Bukowski. And we'll see what we want to do for next week. We could talk about that offline, I suppose. Anyway, thank you very much.
tried to show another side of Bukowski to the public.
You know what? This was the non-profane Bukowski. Thank you for that little angle on it.
It's not difficult to find.
There you go. You've proven that. All right, my friend. We'll see you next week.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye now.